So we're finally up to Parshat Bo, which is on page 340 in the Stone Chumash. It begins in Exodus chapter 10. When I say finally, let me explain, because I'm certainly not meaning to in any way denigrate the first book of the Torah. But Rashi at the start of the Torah asked a question. Why not start from Parshat Bo? Why does he ask that question? Because he's putting forward the opinion that the purpose of Torah, the main purpose of Torah, is to record the 613 mitzvot. He's putting for that idea. And it's this week's Torah reading that we really begin a concentration of mitzvot. In fact, the whole book of Genesis and the book of Exodus until now only contains 3 of the 613 mitzvot. And this week's Torah reading, Parshat Bo, contains 20, 9 positive commandments and 11 negative commandments. So but it also, of course, continues the narrative, is because we have the final 3 plagues taking place. And the theme here of this class is, the title is, what it means to have a sharpened heart, which is a phrase we use before the Shema, v'yached libeinu. The word yached means singular, but it also means sharp. Chad, something that chidudim is sharp. So and we would use the English word focused. It's like when you take light and you focus it on something, so it becomes sharpened. And the other is a koved halev, heavy heart, which we oftentimes translate as a hardened heart. But we're going to look at a medrash which specifically says that it's not that Paro's heart was hard, but it's that it was heavy. And we're going to look at the nuance of difference between the two. Okay? So let's start on chapter 12, sentence 1. And we're going to look, this is in terms of the mitzvot that are in the Torah. And this is on page 348, 349. Actually, that's not okay. That's where mitzvot start, where it says, Hashem said Moshe and Aaron in the land of Egypt, this month shall be for you the beginning of the months, which is the mitzvah of sanctifying the moon. But then, and actually, I don't have the correct source written down. I scramble for a second here. Actually, chapter 12, sentence 17. I'm sorry, I was off by 2 pages. Page 354. So here we're talking about the mitzvah of having matzah and not eating chametz. And the Torah says in sentence 17, you shall safeguard the matzot, ushmartem et hamatzot. For on this very day I've taken your legions out of the land of Egypt. You shall observe this day for your generations as an eternal decree. Now, if you look at the Hebrew, shemartem et hamatzos, so we get from this the phrase of shmura matzah, something many of us have heard already. Shmura matzah means having matzah that has been guarded over or watched. And many people have the custom, not everybody, have the custom that to the Seder itself, you use the big round matzos, which are made by hand, which has an additional component of intentionality. But the concept of watched over matzahs has to do with the following. We actually guard the flour that the matzah is made from to prevent it from getting any moisture. So there's different levels of shmura matzah. Regular matzah, the typical boxed matzah, 18-minute matzah. So there it's guarded from the time that they grind the flour. So therefore, they don't just go to a store and buy flour off the shelf, which could have encountered some moisture between the time it was milled and the time it gets there. But rather, when they actually mill the flour, they put it in special containers and it's marked as being dedicated for the purpose of matzot. And other people have the custom of going all the way back to the actual cutting of the wheat, the ketzira, and they actually have supervision in the field as they cut the wheat. So they wouldn't, for example, harvest on a day when it's raining or a day even when it's particularly moist. They wait for a dry day. They cut the wheat from the ground. They gather the stalks in. They make sure it doesn't come into any contact with water. They bring it to the mill house. It's milled, ground up into flour, and it's guarded over all that time. And that's where we get the idea of shmura matzah. Now, I'm talking here about this topic of sharpening our heart. And I wanted to use this as an example because once the Torah already is teaching us mitzvot, commandments, we know there are many, many nuances to the commandments. Now, you'll find people who will say, don't think there are 613 commandments, there really are 6,130. Because we know that there's nuances, for example, the mitzvah to put on tefillin, how you make the tefillin, how it's made, a lot of things, all the specificity of all the mitzvahs. So we find here a mechilta, a equivalent of a medrash, where it said, don't you say ushmartim et ha-matzot, don't read the sentence as watch over the matzah. Read it, shmartim et ha-mitzvot. Same letters, the same 4 letters of matzot can be read as mitzvot. Sounds like a Hasidic drasha, but it's not. This goes back to the Mechilta. And it's interesting, it has specific halachic ramifications. And that's what I wanted to talk about, this idea of sharpening our focus on mitzvot. In other words, we treat the mitzvot of the Torah and the way they're written in the Torah with a great deal of concern and carefulness and precision in everything that we do. So therefore, for example, we parse every word, we look at every nuance, and there are ramifications in this which in a certain sense expand the mitzvah themselves. Now, of course, the idea of expanding isn't a good idea, because when flour gets wet, that's when it expands, and when it expands, it becomes chametz. But what I mean is in terms of concepts and ideas. So we learn 2 specific laws out of this nuance of the word matzot and mitzvot being spelled the same way. What are they? And these have ramifications in Jewish law. One of them is mitzvah habor yodcha aseh miyad. That's when it says guard the mitzvot. We're using this alternative. Good evening. You have your place there. I'm sure he has the place for you. What it means is don't overlook the opportunity to do a mitzvah and put it off for later. And this general is considered an attribute of called zrizut, alacrity, doing mitzvahs with enthusiasm. And we all know that, when we ask our kids to make their beds, they shuffle their feet, they take some 5 minutes to get into the room, they start playing with the sheets. Everything is like done in slow motion, as if there's a 40-mile-an-hour wind, in the face of every action that they're taking. So the idea here is do things with joy, with quickness. Don't put them off. Time to put it. So an example of this, for example, in the way it's played out in halacha, is we know there's a mitzvah to do the brit milah on the 8th day. So if you look in halacha, it says do it in the morning. Now there's no specification to do it in the morning. You could do it a minute before the sun goes down, because it has to be done during the daylight hours. But from this nuance of understanding, we say do the brit milah in the morning. Now we don't, if possible, we do it that way. Sometimes the mole has 10 brisses to do in the same day, so they're not able to do it until later in the afternoon. Sometimes they have to travel. Sometimes there's issues with the baby coming out of the hospital, whatever it could be. So it's not hard and fast, but as much as possible, we do a brit milah in the morning, first thing, right after davening, whatever the case may be, for the purpose of fulfilling this nuance of the idea of shmartim et ha-mitzvot. We guard the mitzvot. We want to do them right away. And then we have another technical area of Jewish law, which is based on this secondary reading of the sentence. And that is, we're not allowed to overlook one mitzvah to do another. For example, and this is a big example, and the Mishnah says, when the Kohen would walk in first thing in the morning to the temple, so the biggest mitzvah is to clean out and light the menorah. But you see that the order is for the Kohen to first clear the ashes off of the Mizbeach and prepare it for that day's offerings. Why does he have to do that first ahead of the other? And the answer is because when he walks in, he encounters the Mizbeach first. And for him to simply walk past a mitzvah to do another mitzvah is considered to be like dealing with it with the back of your hand. So hence we have a phrase in halacha, ein ma'avirin al ha-mitzvot. We don't pass over a mitzvah to do another. Now, something that's familiar to everybody is if you see challahs on Friday night, when people make a hamotzi lachem in oretz, they cut the bottom challah, they sometimes cut a slice first, they're doing all these different things. Why? So the nuance there is because you have 2 challahs in front of you, technically the one closest to you should be the one that you cut, because otherwise you're like passing over the opportunity to use the top challah to use the bottom one. Yet the prevalent custom is that we use the bottom one on Friday night, and we use the top one on Shabbos morning. Not amongst the most widely known, but the next time you're at somebody's house, or next time you want to observe closely, see how a person cuts the two challahs on the table. But this all comes from this reading of this sentence in the Torah. Okay, because it's like treating every mitzvah with a sense of awesomeness, with a sense of respect, with a sense of enthusiasm, with a sense of joy. So you can see how a little nuanced alternate reading of this sentence in the Torah provokes whole discussions according to Jewish law. Now, for some people, that's very frustrating. For some people, it's like, oh, get off it. Well, the rabbis have nothing better to do than to come up with all these ideas and to treat every single nuance so carefully. That's what this class is out to do, a contrast with a different way of living in the world. But I want to make this point clear. So this is our approach to the weightiness and the importance of every mitzvah that there is. Okay, so that's topic A for tonight, and that has to do with a sharpened heart. When it comes to performing mitzvot, we maintain our sharpness. We read the text very sharply and carefully. We draw nuances out of the text which other people might belittle or think is not important. And we look into very carefully how this would apply to our actual lives and how we can fulfill it. And with that, we're going to go back to the beginning, the first sentence of this week's Torah reading, which is on page 340, 341, chapter 10, sentence 1. It's well known, and I just want to pick up the narrative here. It is, Hashem said to Moshe, come into Paro, and that's a careful translation. El Moshe bo el Paro, literally means like go into him. Rabbi Wein has a very nice idea about this. Now, it's understand Paro. Now, we want to understand Paro not because we want to be like Paro, but because we want to understand what we don't want to be like. Okay, because Paro stands for eternity as an arch opponent standing in the face of God and saying, who's God that I should listen to him? Who's God that I need to pay attention to him? And even if there is a God, and even if I might be forced into acknowledging that in some ways, I'm still going to maintain my own independence, my own sense of grandiosity, and my own, all the false ideas about myself that I want to maintain, right to the bitter end. Right to the bitter, and the bitter end, it turns out, isn't even the death of the firstborn, which is recorded in this week's Torah reading. But the bitter end ends up being when he again chases after the Jewish people and either drowns at the sea himself, according to some opinions, or according to other opinions, he is rescued from the sea to be the lone witness as to how his obstinance always withstood. But if you read the text here, it flows very directly. Let's read it. We'll read the first 5 or 6 sentences here in this week's Torah reading. Hashem says to Moshe, page 341, come into Pharaoh, for I've made his heart and the heart of his servants stubborn. In other words, it doesn't use the word hard here, because it's dealing with a word in the Torah we're going to deal with, which really means heavy. So I can put these signs of mine in his midst, and so that you may relate in the ears of your son and your son's son that I made a mockery of Egypt and my sons that I placed among them, that you may know that I am Hashem. Moshe now come to Pharaoh in sentence 3. So said God of the Hebrews, until when will you refuse to be humbled before me? Send out my people. And very significantly, in sentence 7, Pharaoh's servant said to him, how long will this be a snare for us? Send out the men that they may serve Hashem, their God. Do you not know that Egypt is lost? So here, I just want to point out, this is not fanciful to us. We look at the resistance, to use their word, to acknowledging Israel's right to exist now, or the resistance of the Nazis to relent on killing Jews, even at the expense of losing the war, as is documented in World War II. What we see over and over again through history is that people who choose to be oppositional to God are unrelenting, even at their own personal loss. And it's a wondrous thing to see. It's strange to see. It's not easy to explain. And so that's what we're going to look at here, how this could come about, or at least a perspective on it. Now, of course, we ask questions, for example, is it God hardening Paro's heart, that Paro hardened his heart? all these things. So I want to just point out the Hebrew word here, yani hifbadati, in sentence 1, really means I have made his heart heavy. Doesn't mean hard. The translation we have is an interpretation when it says stubborn, which is what Rashi quotes it as. But we're going to look at a medrash together that literally talks about a heart being heavy. Now, what do we know about heavy things? We know heavy things sink to the bottom. We know heavy things are hard to carry. Okay? And that's the nuance that the medrash is going to pick up on. But in general, in understanding this, I heard Rabbi Wein just the other day mention an idea that the Chavetz Chaim wrote how when he first became a rabbi in a small town, he heard about two families who were arguing in the next town, and he heard that children were dying in the town. And to him, it connected the idea that because of their infighting and their unrelenting hatred for one another, that maybe the town was being punished. So he traveled to the next town. It wasn't really his business. And he spoke to the people. And basically, one of the families told him straight out, and he was a young man at the time. They said to him, Rabbi, mind your own business. Even if it means burying every one of my children, I am not giving in to this other family. And a couple of times said, I will never forget that. And of course, we can relate that idea to Pharaoh here. Now, we're talking about Jewish people there. I'm not trying to make a direct relationship or correlation, but it's clear here that there is a phenomenon in the world that when people take something upon themselves, especially when it's resisting what they know is right, when they take it upon themselves to do wrong or to say that God is not going to ever tell me what to do, people are willing to walk to the ends of the earth or even be swallowed up by the earth itself in order to prove their point. It's tragic, but we certainly see it repeated over and over again in the case of people who take on the Jewish people throughout history. We find there's a readiness to self-destruct and a sense that I'm not giving in no matter what. Pharaoh himself shows this in a couple of ways. Noteworthy, and just to go back, the second plague of frogs. Moshe and Aaron come to Pharaoh, and they say, okay, Pharaoh says, the frogs are insufferable, take them off of us, we'll let the people go. So Moshe asks Pharaoh, and look this up, it's sentence, I'm not sure, I'm going to write it down. But Moshe says, when do you want the plague to end? Now, Pharaoh should have said, now, because he just said it's insufferable. Pharaoh says, at this time tomorrow. Why? Because he said, well, maybe Moshe really isn't in control of the plagues. And maybe if I ask him for this time tomorrow, it'll prove that he's not as perfectly in control, or the God that he's talking about isn't really doing it. Maybe it's magicians. Maybe it's some kind of trickery going on. So he, right from the get-go, he's willing to suffer for 24 hours extra in an intolerable situation simply to perhaps make a chink in what seems to be God's armor. Okay? And if you keep your eyes open, I dare say you won't have to wait long for the rest of this week to see people doing the same things. You know, when they stand on what they consider to be principle or their own honor, they're willing to make things worse for themselves. You know, the other example, and this I didn't think of before, and I just heard it was quoted by Rabbi Finkelstein in Israel. So what did Paro do when the first plague of blood happened? He had his magicians turn water into blood. With the frogs, they had them produce frogs. We don't know exactly what all this means, but that's what the Torah tells us he did, right? People ask a certain question. Wouldn't it have been smarter for Paro to charge his magicians and say, why don't you figure out how to turn the blood back to water and alleviate our suffering? That would have been a logical thing to do, right? We have no water to drink. Everything is blood. Do us a favor. Undo the spell that Moshe put on us so that we can get back to normal. Again, it shows the same idea, this reckless devotion to proving God wrong, to proving God doesn't have anything over me. And it's a very eye-opening thing to see that. And again, you see these behaviors all the time. If you're looking at your own teenage kids, just be forgiving, because hopefully they'll grow out of a lot of it. But you'll see people who are way beyond their teenage years very much acting this way, and Paro was for sure not a teenager. All right, so this brings us to what I think is a very unusual complex and interesting medrash that I want to look at together. It's not in the books here. I have an extra text of it, so you can look on over here. There's English on the bottom and Hebrew on the bottom, but let's just let me present the ideas to you. It has a parable in it, and we'll try to make some sense out of it. So the Midrash is picking up on this word hisbarati. I have made his heart heavy. Okay, what does a heavy heart mean? So the Midrash quotes a sentence from Proverbs right on the top, Mishlei. It says, "A stone has weight, sand is heaviness." But it should say the vexation of foolishness outweighs them both. Okay, so the Midrash here is doing what Midrashim often do. I hope the sound is okay out there because a lot of talking in here, but I think this microphone should keep the sound pretty good. It's a cryptic sentence in Proverbs. A stone is heavy, sand can be heavy, but the annoyance of foolishness is heavier than each of them. So the Midrash here is going to take this sentence and relate it to the words of relate it to the idea of a heavy heart, which is in the sentence we read from this week's Torah, where Hashem says to Moshe, "Go into Paro because I have made his heart heavy." Okay, so it's saying like this heaviness is referring to this sentence. So stay with me here. This is the Medrash. This is what the Medrash says. The Medrash says, once upon a time, there was a tailor. It says weaver here, a tailor, someone who worked with cloth. And he came to the rabbis and asked them, how did God fashion the world? Okay, now if you think about it, tailors, we use the word fashion that way too, but tailors fashion things. They take cloth. A weaver actually takes strands, but I didn't see the translation as weaver. I thought it was a tailor. And you give a tailor a bolt of cloth, you say you've got a special event coming, and the tailor will conceive of something grandiose that makes you look beautiful or makes you look good, cut the fabric, sew it together, design it for you, and create that. So this tailor is interested, how did God fashion the world? Okay, so like he wants to understand what he's doing compared to God, so to speak. So the rabbis answer him very cryptically, why are you asking us? Go to somebody named Abba Yosef. He's a builder. He knows the answer to your question. So right away you see an interplay between being a tailor who takes cloth and fashions something out of it, compared to a builder who certainly works with building materials, but so to speak, envisions the structure and makes it stand. Different idea. Okay? So he goes to this guy, Abba Yosef, and he says to him, I've come to ask you a question. And Abba Yosef basically says, look, I don't have time for you. I'm a day worker. I get paid by the hour. I've got a lot of work to do. What do you want to know? So which is the Medrash's way, I think, of indicating that he didn't take his question very seriously, but he asked him his question. So he said, you want to know how the earth was created? That's easy. God picked up some, and we'll make it more precise here, some sand and some pebbles from underneath his throne. He threw it onto the water, and the world was formed. Okay, not so terribly inconsistent with Genesis, where it says there were waters in the deep, and everything was confused, and God sorted things out, and there was dry land, and there was water land, and there was all these different things. But that's what the Medrash says. It like makes light of it. And it actually quotes a sentence to that effect. It says, when the dirt turns into a mass and the clods cleave together, which has to do with this idea of within creation, somehow there was a joining together of materials to fashion the world as we know it. Okay? Okay. So what do we get from this? Here's what we get from this. And I can't even, the Medrash in Hebrew is longer than the translation in English here, but let me explain to you what it means. So it means like this. So he says, you, the tailor, you want to look at the world and you want to understand, why are the mountains over here? Why are the trees over here? Why are the valleys over here? Why is the water over here? Like, you want to see, what was God's vision for the world? He says, I'm a builder. I want to explain to you how the world stands, what holds the world together. And what he's saying is the world is a bunch of material, rocks and sand, thrown onto water that congeals in such a way that it makes the world stand, which has within it the idea that what supports it is God. In other words, God fashioned a world, and God holds it up, maybe even holds it in his own hands. Now, this is not meant to be a primitive idea of the things we read about with the Greeks and stuff about a guy holding the Atlas, holding the world on his shoulders and all that stuff. It's a concept idea, you see. But then the outcome of that is as follows. So God says, holding up the world, that's easy. I took a little, according to Abba Yosef, I took a little sand, I took some rocks, I threw them down. I can sustain the world forever. No sweat off my back. You know what's hard for me, God says? It's foolishness. It's self-destructive behavior. That, God is saying, so to speak, is heavy for me to hold up. So I think the reading, in a sense, almost becomes like this. Go to Paro, go into Paro, understand him. Ki ani hichbarti et libo. God, so to speak, saying, I'm finding it hard to hold up his heavy heart. I have plenty of strength. I can hold up the whole world. I can sustain all the multiverses without a problem. But foolishness, nonsensical opposition to recognition of God, that's very hard for me to hold up, God says, so to speak. That's heavy for me. So you better go in and talk to Paro, because I'm finding it hard to sustain the foolishness he's under. Okay, this is a very fanciful reading of the situation. What could we make of this reading? And that's what I want to try to do here, and then run to the hills in case the ideas don't make sense. What we're trying to say here is the following thing. People are intrigued on so many things about the world. People challenge God. Why does bad happen to good people? Why does good happen to bad people? Why isn't Israel more like the Riviera? And why is the oil where all the rotten people seem to live? And why is the gold there? And why are the diamond mines there? And what was God thinking? Which is sort of what the tailor is trying to understand. And what the builder is saying is, think of the world as a building that is constructed in a way that is meant to be durable. It's meant to last. It's meant to be something that we can all be proud of and stand on. And the heaviest thing, the most destabilizing element, is the foolishness, the nonsensical antagonism which fragile human beings can bring and throw in the face of God. That's what makes the world totter on its foundations. That's the concept that I'm taking out of this medrash. So in other words, it's an interesting thing here. Hashem is looking down at the world, so to speak. On the one hand, he can see the Jewish people taking the Torah, analyzing every word, every nuance. Oh, it says watch over the matzos. Yeah, but maybe we have a way of watching over the mitzvot. Maybe we need to do them with alacrity. Maybe we need to be careful that we don't push aside one mitzvah to do another mitzvah. Maybe we should really think about what's going to be pleasing in God's eyes with these 613 mitzvahs that he gives us, so that we can fulfill them in a way which is most upbuilding of reality. And by the same token, when you look at the world and the complexity and the things that are wrong in the world, what's most wrong, what's most destabilizing, what's most antagonistic to God's plan in the world is the kind and sort of foolishness that Paro demonstrates in his obstinate clinging to standing in front of God and basically saying, there's no way you're going to humble me. There's no way you're going to soften my heart. There's no way you're going to get me to exceed other than blunt force. And we mentioned in the class last week that that's not God's intention. God does not approach the world with blunt instruments with the idea that either you're going to listen to me or I'm going to crush you. God's idea is I've fashioned a beautiful world with all its complexity, with all of its wonder, with all of its amazement, with all of its mystery. And what I cherish in the world is people being mindful of the mitzvot and the Torah and the directives that I've given the world. And what makes the world difficult for me, God, to sustain, so to speak, is this kind of arrogant foolishness and resistance to do what's right, and resistance to buy into the fact that God does have a plan for the world, and that plan ultimately leads to beauty and goodness. And I think it's just very clarifying as we sort through what has been a confusing year and a half for the Jewish people and a challenging year and a half for the Jewish people. And we understand God has no problem knocking missiles out of the sky so that they don't harm anybody when they're not meant to harm anybody. God has no problem seeing to it that buildings collapse when the right bomb hits them and that the right people die in the process of doing that. What God has a problem with is earning the inner respect and the heartfelt connection between human beings and God. That's what God is aiming for. That's what makes the world worthwhile. And that's what we see the contrast in this week's Torah reading between a sharpened heart that's tuned in to what God believes is most important and a heavy heart that is simply sinking and taking with it many other people and perhaps even taking with it all of humanity if we don't stand up and do what's right. And I think that's a big insight as we begin the parts of the Torah that is replete with mitzvot. You know, we begin to really get into the 613 mitzvot as channels and ways of fulfilling God's will in the world with all their complexity. And as we learn from the negative example of Paro and all the Paros who continue to take his place in history, and we look at the example they set for us and we shudder and we do our best to see to it that we don't follow in that example. And please God, our hearts should become ever sharper and clearer, and we should have less and less reason to feel heaviness of heart, and we should see the world head in the direction that it really should be.